happy Valentine's Day. There are about a million videos I could have made and released today. I am a romance reader, so there are a plethora of videos I could have made on that topic, but in my heart of hearts, I'm a horror girly, and right now, not only is romantic-focused horror having a bit of a moment, Companion and Hard Eyes literally both just came out, but my personal favorite subgenre of horror is also making a bit of a comeback into the mainstream. Hi there, I'm Emily, and welcome back to my channel. Valentine's Day feels like the perfect time to talk about gothic horror. The entirety of the holiday is kind of in theme with a lot of what gothic horror is about, and I cannot think of a better time to try and introduce you all to the world of gothic horror, which is my favorite horror subgenre. Now, this video isn't just going to be a recommendation video. There's been quite a lot of discourse, especially after Nosferatu, about what gothic literature and by extension other media actually is. So before I get into my personal gothic horror recommendations, I'm going to very briefly go over what gothic literature even is, just so that we can all have a common understanding, even though I do think gothic literature is one of the most widely varied for interpretation genres that there is. So this is just going to be kind of like very much the basics and high level kind of stuff, because I think everyone's interpretation of gothic literature can be very different. So just high level, here we go. The big question: what the heck is gothic horror? What the heck is gothic literature? How is gothic literature different than gothic horror? Isn't gothic horror kind of redundant? Isn't all gothic literature gothic horror? And I'm not going to answer all of those questions, but I will answer some of them. I think something that's pretty critical to understanding what gothic horror even is and what gothic literature even is understanding how gothic literature originated and what really brought it about. Gothic literature is a direct result and extension of the Romanticism era, and Romanticism was a direct result and opposition to the Enlightenment period. So Romanticism is very much a rejection of all of the logic and order and science that was brought about in the Enlightenment period, and a rejection of all of that and all of those rules in exchange for very deeply exploring the chaos of human emotions and passion and the complexities and nonsensicality that exists in nature. And Gothic literature grew directly out of this line of thinking. Gothic literature directly extends the focus that Romanticism has on human emotion and passion, while also delving into and exploring much darker and taboo themes. Gothic literature is also kind of in opposition to the Protestant age that was rising right before Gothic literature and the kind of like puritanical culture that was rising in Europe and England especially. And so a lot of Gothic literature was directly exploring the human emotion and passion within darker themes that were kind of frowned upon by the church. Specifically, Gothic horror very often romanticizes and explores death and the fear of death, but also kind of the intrigue that all humans, I think, have in death. And also something that Gothic literature very often does is it explores sexuality, which was very frowned upon by the church, as you can imagine. Specifically women's sexuality. So there's a lot of exploration about like the dichotomy of wanting things that are not status quo. And that's really a lot of what Gothic literature is and how it was born. And I think Gothicism and Gothic horror in general, like I said, are some of the most unique subgenres, because the definition of Gothicism and Gothic literature, in my opinion, is very broad, and I truly believe that every person categorizes and experiences Gothic literature in a different way, which is one of the reasons that it's one of my favorite subgenres, and also more generally why I'm such a big fan of horror. Is I also think that horror is like the broadest genre to exist, and every single person has a different experience with every single piece of horror media that's ever been created, and Gothicism and Gothic horror is directly an extension of that, in my opinion. I think everyone takes such different things away from Gothic literature and Gothic media, and that's specifically why I was so annoyed with all of the people after Nosferatu came out. There was a lot of online discourse about people who were telling other people that they didn't understand Gothic literature or they didn't understand the point of the movie just because they took something different away from it. But horror as a broad genre, and Gothic horror specifically, are so personalized and unique to every person that experiences them that I truly don't think there's really one way to categorize Gothic horror and Gothic literature specifically, and everyone takes something vastly different away from every piece of media, no matter if the creator's intent was for them to take that away. I think that's really the beauty of horror and the beauty of Gothic literature as well. So yes, I did just give you a definition, but that's very broad and kind of the general basis of Gothic horror. But I think every single person considers Gothic horror something different, and I'm sure there's books I'm going to recommend on this list that if you asked someone else who really loves Gothic literature, they might not even consider these Gothic, or they might consider something Gothic that I don't. So it's a pretty broad, fluid definition and a fluid term. So just keep that in mind, I guess, moving forward. I do want to say, though, one misconception I think that exists about Gothic literature is that Gothic literature has to take place during a very specific time period, and I personally don't agree with that. There are certainly a lot of classicists who would argue that Gothic literature must take place during a time when Gothic architecture would exist, as that's kind of where Gothicism and Gothic literature got its name, but I personally think that ignores the main basis of how Gothic literature originated. Like every other genre, Gothic literature is an ever-evolving entity, and there is definitely such a thing as modern Gothic literature. Gothic literature literally is just exploring the depths of human passion and emotion while also exploring things that are a taboo or dark, things that fascinate us as humans, but also kind of freak us out a bit. That's really what Gothic literature is, and kind of takes some of those things that really freak us out as humans and romanticizes them to make them a little easier to deal with. So there's definitely such a thing as modern Gothic literature. People haven't stopped contemplating death since Gothic architecture stopped existing or stopped being built. And so I think saying that Gothic literature has to take place during that time period is untrue. So with that being said, on to my recommendations. I'm going to kind of break the recommendations up into two parts. The first, I'm going to go through a bunch of Gothic horror books that I've read that I really very highly recommend and really enjoyed. And then the other part of this is going to be Gothic horror that is very high on my TBR, that there's a couple that are coming out this year that aren't out yet. So there's those, but then the rest of them are definitely ones that I really, really want to get to. As far as the books that I've actually already read go, I've kind of tried to break these up into like mini categories. I have 4 different mini categories. 2 of them are kind of related to each other, but the first 2 are pretty separate from each other. So the first mini category is kind of classic Gothic horror. These are not all classics. I have 3 recommendations for this subcategory, but they are all books that kind of exude the classic Gothic feeling that you directly think of when I say the word Gothic. You know, old European, dark gray cathedrals, that kind of vibe. All 3 of these give that. So that's going to be my first little category. And of course, I don't think I can really talk about classic Gothic horror and not mention Carmilla. Carmilla is one of the plethora of works that directly inspired Dracula. But Carmilla is a little bit different than Dracula. Carmilla is very short as opposed to the behemoth that is Dracula. So if you're looking to dip your toe into classic Gothic horror, this might be a good one for you. But in addition to that, this book kind of establishes some of the tropes that are then used in Dracula. The earth that they were buried in thing, that's in Carmilla. And also, Carmilla very much has a exploration of taboo romance, because even though this was written quite a while ago, this is a sapphic romance. So yes, like I said, many a time, Gothic horror often explores things that are seen as taboo in society, and sapphic romance definitely would have been that during this time. This discusses a lot and explores a lot, actually, the kind of ease with which their sapphic relationships could be hidden in history. Women could be very, very close to each other, and no one would really suspect anything romantic. They would just be like, oh, they're really close friends. Oh, they're companions. But there could be romance going on under the surface, and this kind of explores that in quite a variety of ways. It's very interesting, very Gothic feeling. There's a lot of old-timey Gothic stuff going on. We have graveyard scenes, cemetery scenes, a lot of very creepy Gothic imagery. And I just think that this is a really, really good one to start out with if you're really looking for that kind of classic Gothic literature, if you're wanting to read something that is really classic, written in the time period, takes place in the time period, sets up a lot of the tropes that we have nowadays. Carmilla. Moving forward a bit in time and to an entirely different continent, I think that this is also a crucial classic Gothic book. The author of this, I think, is pretty quintessential American Gothic horror. American Gothic is slightly different than European Gothic. It doesn't have a lot of those like Gothic architecture, towering cathedral kind of things, but there is very often the exploration of the horror in America of vast spaces. Is typically explored a lot in especially classic American Gothic, and also the kind of weird rigidity of our societal structures, patriarchy, caste system, racism kind of stuff. There's a lot of exploration of that in American Gothic horror. And so this author that is of the next book kind of helped establish a lot of that, and is definitely a modern American Gothic classic author. Very much recommended when people discuss American Gothic horror. And that is Shirley Jackson, and the book specifically by Shirley Jackson that I have read is The Haunting of Hill House. You will immediately notice I did not use the show tie-in cover here, and that is because if you've watched the show, I have watched the show. It is very incredible. I love Mike Flanagan. I've seen it multiple times. However, if you're going to read this book, do not go in with the expectations that it is like the show at all. That's always a caveat I have to give whenever I'm recommending this book. This book is really, really brilliant and really explores relationships in a very unique way. It wasn't written as a sapphic story, but there is kind of an air of sapphic implications in this book. And Shirley Jackson did come out and say like that wasn't her intention when she was writing it, but I think it's very easy to read that way, and I think that that's okay if you read it that way. I read it that way, and I am not going to apologize for that, even though the author didn't intend it. Like I said, Gothic literature is very much personalized, and people will often take things away that the author did not really intend, and this is definitely one of those cases. So this has a lot of explorations of just like relationships in general. There's some exploration of romantic interest and relationships, but the vast majority of this story is focused on our main character and kind of the turmoil that she's going through of being in this stagnant point in her life. She feels like she's not accomplishing anything. She has all of the societal expectations to like get married and have a family and all that kind of stuff, especially for the time period that this was written and set in. And she kind of ends up at this house, and crazy things, really creepy things start happening, and you kind of witness her like becoming entranced by these really creepy things that are happening. And that's also part of Gothic horror, romanticizing creepy, horrifying things. And this book definitely does that and explores a lot of very broad themes, but also pretty American specific themes. So again, if you're looking to get into something that is a little more specific to American Gothic literature instead of European Gothic literature, The Haunting of Hill House, or generally Shirley Jackson, is one that I would recommend. Then we have a very recently published book. This book came out last year, but it captures the quintessential Gothic feeling so well, I had to include it in this section, even though it's not a classic by any means. It has the European sense. It has all of the Gothic architecture, the crumbling facades. There's a lot of creepy imagery, lots of ghosts, lots of romanticization of death and of ghosts and of what is beyond life, and also exploration of multiple taboo kinds of relationships. This one is also sapphic. Somehow all three that I recommended in this category are either explicitly sapphic or have sapphic undertones. Love that. But this is My Darling Dreadful Thing. This book is just so evocative of classic Gothic feelings. When I say Gothic, this book is literally like exactly what's in your mind. That's what this book is. There is death, there is ghosts, there is spiritual, supernatural stuff going on, there is taboo relationships in this, very much besides the sapphic veen relationship. There is doing really macabre things in this name of love. This just really has it all, and I think that this is just like so quintessential classic Gothic themes, Gothic vibes. It's just such a love letter to the classics, really, I think. But also exploring even more and exploring more themes that we kind of associate with the modern day in the classic time period and setting. So yeah, if you're looking for something that is written more recently, so it kind of has more diversity, like I said, there's the sapphic main relationship, but there's also BIPOC characters in this, which is pretty usually lacking from classic Gothic literature. This has all of that classic Gothic feel while adding some of those things that we really appreciate in modern literature. So if that's what you're looking for, My Darling Dreadful Thing is a great one to check out. Okay, my next category. This kind of seems like a weird category, but I'm really just so in love with what all of these books are doing and kind of the mini rise that we've seen in this. And that is Mexican Gothic horror. I love this little moment that we're having right now with Mexican Gothic horror. It is brilliant, and I've loved every single piece of literature I've read that fits kind of within this mini category, and there's so many new releases that are coming this year that I'm so excited for that fit into this category as well. But the three recommendations I have that I have actually read, I cannot talk about Mexican Gothic horror without talking about Mexican Gothic, obviously. This is actually the book that kind of really got me started into not only horror literature. I kind of was consuming horror media before I read this book, but this book specifically got me into horror literature. But this book also really started my love for Gothic horror. Specifically, I didn't really consume a ton of Gothic horror before I read this book. I had maybe a couple, Crimson Peak has always been a fave of mine, and that's pretty quintessential Gothic media, but I hadn't really explored this subgenre a ton before I read this book, and this book is just so beautifully done. There is so much eeriness, but also romantic atmosphere going on in this book. The house is dilapidated and crumbling, but also beautiful, and our main character is enraptured by it, but also horrified by it. And I don't think that anything quintessentially screams Gothic horror more than characters being both horrified and obsessed with something. That's pretty spot on Gothic. And this just adds so many themes to Gothic literature that haven't been added historically. The origination of Gothic horror was very much a European thing and also traveled to white America. But this really explores how that kind of thing that traveled also would have impacted people of color. Specifically, this one is examining Mexico during that time period. There's a lot of the kind of classic elements of Gothic horror while also exploring new themes that Gothic literature doesn't typically touch on. Like I said, all three of these books very much explore colonialism. And I just think this book does a really excellent job, and I will always highly recommend this book. I love Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I'm really excited for her book that's coming out this year. And I just think that this is a great one to read, especially if you're looking for a bit more diversity in your Gothic literature. All right, the next two are by the same author, which slightly feels like cheating, but I'm obsessed with both of them, and the book that's coming out this year by this author is in my TBR recommendations section, but that is Isabel Cañas. The two books that she's written that I have loved and read are The Hacienda and Vampires of El Norte. These both fall into that category of Mexican Gothic horror. They both take place in Mexico, very much around the same time period as Mexican Gothic as well. These kind of all take place during the same time period when colonization of Mexico was really ramping up, and America was trying to infringe on Mexico, and they both have a lot of discussions about that Mexican Gothic as well. The Hacienda is a little bit more focused on kind of like ghostly, supernatural kind of stuff, and explores more colorism and that kind of racism and the classism that exists in Mexico during this time period, and has a lot more of that discussion of like wealth disparity and all of that kind of stuff. And it is really beautiful. The atmosphere is incredible. The supernatural elements are really well done. Just very highly recommend both of these books by Isabel Cañas. But if you're looking more for like the supernatural edge of Gothic literature, or you're looking for more discussions about wealth disparity more than colonization, then the Hacienda is the way to go as far as Isabel Cañas goes. And then Vampires of El Norte. Yes, this does have vampires. No, it does not have classic vampires. The spin that Isabel Cañas puts on vampires in this book, I think, is really brilliantly done. But if you go in expecting like Dracula vampires, you're not going to get that, and you will be confused and disappointed. So I'm telling you right now, don't go in expecting that, but do read this book because it's really incredible, and the vampires are really, really interesting and used in the most brilliant way to really emphasize the themes that Isabel Cañas is exploring in this. This one does also have discussions of kind of wealth disparity that existed in Mexico during this time period, but whereas the Hacienda is like, I would say the Hacienda is more focused on the wealth disparity and less focused on the colonization, and then Vampires of El Norte kind of flips that. Vampires of El Norte is more focused on the colonization aspects, but then also has discussions of wealth disparity and classism, stuff like that. So if you're looking for something that's more not on the like supernatural side, but more creature-esque and more the horrors of actual war, Vampires of El Norte is going to be the one for you. And this was one of my favorite books of last year. I cannot recommend this book enough. I will recommend this book to any and everyone until the day I die. So if that's not enough of a glowing review and recommendation, I don't know what else is. My next two categories are things that some people might not consider Gothic literature or Gothic horror, and I'm kind of okay with that. I consider them to be Gothic enough for this recommendation. The first one is kind of like Gothic fairy tales, ? This one is just 2 books, and this is also the category that has 1 book. This is the only book on here that's not explicitly horror, but it is so Gothic feeling and uses so many tropes and themes that are present in almost all Gothic literature that I had to include it in this, even though it's not horror explicitly. But these both are kind of like twists on fairy tales, explorations of the things that are in fairy tales, but that we maybe romanticize too much in our real lives. Fairy tales are a very romantic way of looking at the world, and whereas Gothic literature usually takes something that's kind of grotesque or taboo or macabre and romanticizes it a bit, I think these two both examine the things that we romanticize in our real life and put a horrifying twist on them. So they're kind of a subversion of the Gothic horror genre almost a little bit, while also being very true to the essence of what Gothic horror is. So these ones are kind of both interesting in that way. But the first book, which is not horror, but is kind of just fantasy, but has a very Gothic feel to it, is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. This is very much an exploration of fairy tales and kind of like the horrors of fairy tales. This follows such a fairy tale format. This has definitely magic in it, and it's just, I don't even know really how to describe it. It's Gothic, it's fairy tale, it's fantasy, it's magical realism, it's a romance, like it's just so much differentness all in one thing. And I think I would most accurately categorize this as like a Gothic fairy tale with very much magic in it. So yeah, if you're looking for something that's maybe not explicitly horror, but has, some of those things that are in Gothic horror, typically, there's a house that's kind of crumbling and also not crumbling. It is a sentient house. There is a lot of exploration of death in this book, and a lot of exploration of like hidden truths and jealousy and very human emotions and passions and everything like that. So if you're looking for something that has a very Gothic feel to it, but maybe aren't ready to dip your toe into horror yet, this is my recommendation for you for that. The other book in this category is one that I very, very recently read, and that is Rouge by Mona Awad. I think even though this is one of those ones that I think, again, other people might not consider Gothic at all, because this is set in the modern day. There is technology in it. There is definitely no Gothic architecture in this book at all. This is very much not during a Gothic time period, but I just think that the themes that are explored in this book and the structure of this book are so Gothic in nature and in feeling. I talked about it during my journal video, but when I was making my journal page for this, I kept talking about how it just felt nostalgic for some reason and vintage, even though it takes place in the modern day. And I think that feeling that I was trying to accurately capture was that it feels Gothic, which necessarily and kind of correlated feels nostalgic and old-timey, even if it takes place in the modern day, because there's so much romanticization of really strange things. There is kind of a subversion of vampires in this, which you don't find out until the very end. They're not actually really vampires. That didn't really spoil anything, but the more I thought about it, the more I was like, the way that the bad people in this book act and the act that they are doing is kind of a subversion of vampirism, and I think that was really interesting. And there's a lot of exploration of jealousy, very human emotions. There's a lot of exploration of the complexities of relationships. There is very much a toxic relationship kind of thing going on in this that is explored and very much romanticized in the way that it's told, but you're not supposed to feel like it is a good kind of relationship, if that makes sense. Like the character that is telling this story, you can obviously tell that they romanticize it, but to you as the audience are like, wow, that's actually really horrifying. And even though it takes place in the modern day, this is one of the things I mean where all genres, even Gothic literature, are ever evolving. Okay, on to my last category of recommendations. These are kind of, again, things that I don't think that necessarily everyone would consider Gothic in general, but still books that I recommend. They don't really have anything in common besides that I think these will probably be like the most controversial that I have of whether they're Gothic or not. But yeah, the first is Our Wives Under the Sea. I think it's one of those books that has really incredible themes and really explores the depth of human emotion. And there's a lot of grotesque things happening in this book. And there's, again, a lot of romanticization of things that maybe we would find very grotesque and be very afraid of if we are actually experiencing them in real life. This one's also sapphic, going in line with my theme for this video, I guess. And it really just explores the complexities of love and romantic relationship and how far you're willing to go for the people that you love, no matter how much they change, no matter what they're becoming and what kind of creature they're turning into. This one, again, is pretty modern day. There's a whole section of this book that takes place in a submarine, so very much not Gothic architecture time period, but I think the themes and the explorations are very much in line with Gothic literature and Gothic horror. So, Our Wives Under the Sea, this one's more kind of sci-fi Cthulhu-esque, if that's your thing. And my very last recommendation of Gothic horror is one that most people might not consider Gothic horror because it takes place in like a colonial time period, which isn't typically what's considered Gothic time period, but I think this, again, explores a lot of those themes, and it does a lot of that romanticization that Gothic literature typically does, and that is The Year of the Witching. This, like I said, is kind of a colonial time period, but this really explores and deconstructs religious ideation, which, like I mentioned during when I was talking about how Gothic literature kind of even came to originate, a lot of it was directly in rebellion with the rise in puritanical thinking and Protestant ideology that was happening in Europe. And the entirety of this book is kind of also in opposition to those same things, even if it's not directly the same religion. The religion in this book is different than our real world religions, but it does draw a lot of similarities and a lot of parallels to the things that Gothic literature was kind of revolting against. And so that's really why I put it on this list. And it also just has a lot of that exploration. There's romance in this, and you kind of like don't want it to happen, and you kind of do want it to happen, which is very much a Gothic literature kind of feeling. There is a lot of exploration of human emotions and relationship dynamics, both in a romantic sense and not in a romantic sense. There is a lot of horror elements that are really interesting in this. This one is witch focused, so if you're looking for witches, as the title would suggest, this has lots of witches in it. And if you're looking for something that's a little more fantasy aspect-y as well, this is one that I would recommend for fantasy lovers. If you're a fantasy lover and are looking to get into horror, or specifically Gothic horror, The Year of the Witching is going to be your go-to. And that is all my recommendations that I have. I'm very quickly going to run through kind of some upcoming reads that I have, or some reads that I have on my TBR that I'm really excited to read that definitely fit into the Gothic horror genre. I'm not going to really give too much of a synopsis for these just because I feel like this is getting unreasonably long for what I had originally planned for this video. I've done a lot more rambling than I expected to do. So yeah, I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. First up, we have House of Hunger. This is written by Alexis Henderson, who is the same author that wrote The Year of the Witching, and this is vampires. So the fact that her first book, The Year of the Witching, was already kind of in the Gothic genre for me, and the fact that this one is vampires is definitely giving me major Gothic vibes, and it's definitely on my TBR. Next up, another repeat author, Blood on Her Tongue. This is by Johanna van Veen, which is the author of My Darling Dreadful Thing. This one doesn't have any explicit mentions of romance in it. This one is about a woman and her sister who is deteriorating in health and sanity. And this comes out this year. I'm very excited. I was kind of shocked and blown away by My Darling Dreadful Thing. That was the author's first book, and I really, really enjoyed it and loved it. I read an arc of it before it came out and was super impressed with it. And when I saw that she was releasing another book this year, I was like, that's definitely going on my TBR. And I anticipate that this will also have a very gothic feeling and gothic themes. That seems to be kind of what she loves based on her first book and based on her author website. So I'm very excited to get to that one. Next, we have Lucy Undying, which is a Dracula novel, and of course that's going to be gothic. I read Hide by Kierstan White, which is very much not gothic. That's very much more like a creature feature kind of book, but I really enjoyed that, and so I'm anticipating that I will enjoy Lucy Undying as well, and this one definitely fits into the theme of being gothic. Then we have Always Lived in the Castle. This is by Shirley Jackson, obviously included on this list already. But The Haunting of Hill House is actually the only Shirley Jackson book that I've read, and I just really want to read We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It's the one that I feel like I hear everyone talk about the most. It's a lot of people's favorites. A lot of people that I have pretty in line book tastes with really love this book, and it's on my 25 in 2025, so I had to put it here as well, as it is very likely an American Gothic book, and I'm very excited to read it, and will definitely be reading it this year. Then we have Fledgling by Octavia Butler. I'm currently reading Kindred, which is my first Octavia Butler book, but this one I know 100% is about a vampire, and I've heard really great things about it. It feels very much like Southern Gothic to me. I forgot to mention when I was talking about The Year of the Witching, that falls in that category as well of Southern Gothic, but this feels the same, but also has vampires and Gothic, and Octavia Butler weaves in really complex and intricate themes into her works, so we'll definitely be checking out Fledgling. And then lastly, we have the book by Isabel cañas that is coming out this year. I'm so excited for this book, and that is The Possession of Alba, Díaz. And like I mentioned, I've loved both of Isabel cañas' previous works. The Vampires of El Norte was one of my favorite books from last year. It was in my top 10, and I'm really just so excited for The Possession of Alba, Díaz, and definitely it falls within the Gothic category. I'm assuming it will be in the same Gothic category as her two previous works. And that's all. That's all my TBR of like 6 really highly anticipated Gothic books that I am planning to read. If you have any more Gothic recommendations, let me know. I'm obsessed with Gothic horror. I really love it. This has kind of just been a brief list of all the Gothic horror I've read. This is no way encapsulating of all my Gothic horror reads. These are just the ones that I feel are best to read as kind of an introduction, or are very specific recommendations, like for Gothic horror that is a little bit more diverse. I've definitely read some pretty white Gothic horror that doesn't have diversity, and I always want to make sure that I'm recommending as diversity as possible because it's something that I really value in my reading. So that seemed like a really long outro. I don't know why I rambled so much there. I'm gonna end it there. I hope you enjoyed this little video. We'll see how long this is when I edit it down. This has definitely been much longer than I was anticipating recording. Hopefully you found something or just enjoyed the process of me talking about Gothic horror. I'll see you again soon for some more bookish content.